Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to talk about the early years of Sanguinius's life. So the life of Sanguinius before he was reunited with the Emperor. So the homeworld of Sanguinius is Baal. But to be more accurate, it's the second moon of Baal, Baal Secundus, that is where he arrived as a baby Primarch in his gestation pod after being sent across the galaxy by the powers of chaos. So he landed on this moon, which was an irradiated, scorched wasteland, a desert, a death world, a world that humanity had lived on, and in more prosperous times had an advanced civilization on, but had fallen back into barbarism and had broken down into small tribal groups and hordes of wandering mutants that preyed upon these tribes of surviving humans. There were many mutated animals as well that were also extremely dangerous. The air and soil itself was dangerous. It was so strongly irradiated and toxic, full of toxins. The water was unsafe, etc. It was an extremely hard place to live, and therefore supported quite a small population, and that population were very prone to mutations and prone to disease, etc. There was very little positive you can say about this place. Now, because Sanguinius would grow to become a religious figure on Baal and its moons, and was the focus of the worship of its people, because of how miraculous he was, everything he did in his past or during his life became a story within their religious tradition. And so you can't trust any of the stories because they're all full of miracles and things that he is supposed to have said and done that had religious significance. And like in any religion, those stories become more important than the event itself as an historical event. And they become about teaching a particular moral or about explaining why a particular religious practice happens, and instead of just telling you what actually happened at that point. So, for example, Sanguinius is potentially supposed to be found by the people of Baal as a baby still, and as a baby still be vulnerable enough for them to be able to kill him, with the appearance of this angelic child, but having the signs of his wings, just sort of the tiny stubs of his wings coming out. So it's clear that he is some way different to a normal human baby, that he is mutant in some sense. And because these people have this deep fear of mutants and deep hatred of mutants because they're constantly fighting them to survive, there was a strong reason to kill him as a child. But because of the goodness within the people of Baal that found him, that compassion prevailed and they didn't kill him. That's one of their stories. And obviously that could be true, but it could simply be a story that's been created just to explain and emphasize just how good the people of Baal are and have always been. So was Sanguinius found as a baby, or was he actually wandering in the wasteland until he was the size of a fully grown man when he was found by the people of Baal? It's hard to say. But what we do know is that he was within these wastelands, whether that was from a very young age with other people or on his own. He did survive within these wastelands, and he did perform things that could be interpreted as miracles from the outside. So if you don't know he's a Primarch, you might think, well, this is incredible. He defeated this monstrous creature, or he killed all these mutants in one go. As we know, Sanguinius has psychic abilities, and although they don't express themselves quite so obviously as they would in someone like Magnus, they are there throughout his life, and that would have some play in his early life. He is said to have sometimes had light around his head, and we know he could see the future. If he could see the future at this time in his very young age, that would play into this idea of him as a divine being, this religious figure, or a prophet in a sense. So in many ways, Sanguinius makes the perfect center of a religious tradition to build up around because of these abilities that he has, and because of his angelic appearance, but this almost perfect human appearance, but with these wings that mark him out as different. But the wings themselves, although a sign of mutation, are also perfect in their form if they were on a bird or something. All this comes together to create a perfect catalyst for stories to grow up around, and therefore obscure the reality of whatever happened. And when you know that the reality of whatever happened could itself be extraordinary because of the person that was involved, it makes it practically impossible for us on the outside, or even within universe imperial historians, to pick out what actually happened and what didn't happen. So given how terrible a world Baal was, how difficult it was to survive there, clearly Sanguinius had the ability to survive in these conditions, and to not just survive, but to thrive. He didn't turn into a feral monster, roving the wastelands, killing to survive, like some of his brothers did, who landed on similarly very difficult worlds to survive on. He somehow retained his noble spirit, his ability to be reasonable and compassionate to others, even though he was surrounded by deadly conditions. And he was embraced by these people, if potentially after some initial suspicion. And not only did they take him in amongst them, he would very quickly grow to be this figure of worship because of just how incredible he was. And so, because their society was very basic, there wasn't much they could teach him, but he almost instantly learned everything he could from them. But unlike some of the other Primarchs, there was no structure, there was no kingdom or military or government that he could learn about, or how to do any of those things. And yet again, he didn't become a simple barbarian like some of the other Primarchs would. He somehow became this incredible statesman, this person with the ability to give incredibly inspiring speeches. He was incredibly eloquent, even though he had grown up on this barbarian world. He was very reasonable and rational, even though he was surrounded by essentially religious fanatics, and he was the focus of that religious fanaticism. He didn't let any of that go to his head as well. So he was obviously a very humble person as well. So imagine in a situation where from birth, or effectively birth, you are the center of everyone else's attention, and everyone says you are the most amazing thing they've ever seen, and you're so incredible, they can't imagine anything you couldn't do, and yet somehow still retain the ability to criticize yourself, to be aware that you can make mistakes, to have that self-awareness that he had after living in that environment. Can you imagine some of the other Primarchs being able to do that? No, not really. So it's very clear that within Sanguinius's genetic heritage, whatever the Emperor did to create Sanguinius, he very much hit the jackpot here. He created a Primarch that was so perfect that even though he was in these very difficult circumstances, even though he was in a situation which very easily could have led to him being a very different person, and a person that would be much less useful to the Imperium than Sanguinius would be, and potentially even a great enemy of the Imperium, because that's generally what happens to people who are treated in the way that he was, where being a focus of everyone's adulation and being told that you're perfect in every way doesn't usually create good people. So we have to put that down to that innate part of him, that he is simply that good. That's just who he is. And no matter what circumstances he was going to find himself in, he was going to come out the other end being the angel, the most noble of all the Primarchs, the brightest Primarch, the best. Ultimately, Sanguinius is the best Primarch, despite what happened to him as a child, not because of it. And any of the other Primarchs in that same circumstances would not have come out being like he was, being as good as he was, and I mean good in every sense of the word. No, not just being morally good, or I just mean great, capable, exceptional. He was all of those things and morally good, and being told all the time that he was all these things, and yet never becoming arrogant or conceited like many of the other Primarchs did. So in really, Sanguinius is like the ultimate symbol of what was wrong with all the other Primarchs. He had every chance to go off the rails and never did. He even had this, what he felt was a deep flaw within him, this broken something that led to his dark rage that he had, which of course would afflict some of his sons. And that was his main flaw, in a sense, was that he felt that he was flawed. And yet it never actually caused him to do anything wrong. You could argue that the only thing it did was it held him back his whole life within the Imperium. He never felt that he was good enough to be the War Master. He never felt that he was good enough to be the number one amongst the Primarchs. When he was made Emperor by Guilliman and the Lion, he didn't feel that he deserved it. He did it because it would keep the peace, basically. And that's all he ever wanted to do, was keep the peace amongst his brothers and help humanity reach its ultimate potential. So you could argue that was his flaw, because it stopped him reaching his full potential. Had he not had this dark rage that he felt could potentially be a danger to the Imperium, he might have stepped up a bit more and gone, actually, I should be the War Master, not Horus. And maybe if the Emperor had seen that, maybe he would have made Sanguinius the War Master. It's always been a great mystery amongst the lore of why did Horus get picked instead of Sanguinius. Even Horus himself thought Sanguinius should be the War Master. In the few times that Horus could actually self-reflect and see that he wasn't actually as good as he thought he was. And yet the Emperor, who seemingly is all-knowing and is perfect in every way, couldn't see that Sanguinius should have been the War Master. Always a great mystery. But of course, it's required for the story. Sanguinius needs to be that noble sacrifice, while Horus is the number one son that turns on his father. It's obviously a classic story. But is it actually if we want to put a real reason in there, rather than just the needs of the writers, is it with the Emperor's ability to perceive that Sanguinius was holding back and was afraid of something within himself, and that made him unsuitable for being the War Master, for being the number one Primarch? Or is it because the Emperor had other plans for him and always knew that he would need Sanguinius to make the ultimate sacrifice for him and the Imperium to allow him to defeat Horus? Well, that's another grander scheme that could be the case. And that's if you go down the road of that the Emperor knew everything was going to happen as it did happen all the way along, and he knew it was inevitable. I don't personally subscribe to that, because I think it's very clearly stated throughout the whole of the Warhammer 40k lore that nothing is fixed in stone. None of the futures that anyone sees, because there's many people in 40k who can see the future, they all accept that those futures are all possible futures. They're not actually what's going to happen. And that is reiterated many, many times in many, many different books from many different people. And it's borne out in experience that people often think something's going to happen, it doesn't happen. And you can change what you see as the future. It's not fixed. So the fact that whatever the Emperor thought was going to happen could only be based on probability and not on any fixed certainty. And so he would have been planning for what he thinks might happen. So I don't think it's fair to say that the Emperor didn't make Sanguinius War Master because he thought he needed Sanguinius to be this noble sacrifice who would create the chink in Horus's armor, or that he could defeat him, or anything like that. What I'm trying to get to is Sanguinius is very clearly essentially flawless. And so none of those things that happened to him as a child, the terrible conditions that he arrived on, whatever he had to do to survive in those early years when he had nothing but a wasteland full of mutants and monsters, the way he was treated by the people of Baal, which you could say, well, they treated him well. Yeah, they did, but that's not necessarily a good thing if the way that people treat you is complete adoration. It's not just they weren't teaching him morals. They weren't teaching him a way to be a good person. So, for example, Gilliman got training in how to be a noble leader of his people from his father, or his foster father, if you like. He was told, "You're just the perfect being. Look at how brilliant you are. We'll do anything for you. We love you." And endlessly, over and over again, and yet that didn't corrupt him in any way. That says, at his core, Sanguinius is essentially uncorruptible. He's practically invulnerable to going down this path to becoming what Horus became, or becoming what many of the other Primarchs became. He just didn't have that in him. He was genuinely good and uncorruptible in all senses of the word, or as close as it's possible to be in the 40k world. Now, another big running theme within Sanguinius's life is this idea of sacrifice. Now, he is the ultimate sacrifice for the Imperium. He has to die for the Emperor to survive, in a sense, to defeat Horus. That's always been part of the lore of 40k universe. And it seems like, it's hard to tell, but he seems like he knows that for at least a large period of his time, that he's going to die at the hands of Horus. It's certainly during the heresy, he seems to know that most of the time. And how much before that he knew that something like that was going to happen, it's hard to say. Another example of this would be going back to his early life. When the Emperor first arrives, he essentially sacrifices himself to the Emperor for his people, because he knows from his visions, from his ability to see the future, that the emperor is coming. He doesn't really know exactly what's happening, who's coming, or exactly what they'll be like, but he knows a decent amount of that. And he's afraid for his people. He's afraid that the emperor will purge them for being religious, for worshipping him, for being anti-imperial truth in a sense. Even though they are a noble, fair, balanced people, at least it seems that way, that he's taught them to be a good people in most senses. They clearly have this religious adoration for him, and he knows that that goes against the imperial truth. He knows that the emperor has a dark side and is very dangerous under the right circumstances, so he is fearful for his own people, and he essentially makes a deal with the emperor and says, I will be your servant, I will do whatever you ask me to do, but you have to spare my people. And the emperor agrees, and that seems to be how Baal survives being purged of its religious belief. They're essentially protected by the continued service of Sanguinius for the emperor, and Sanguinius throws himself fully into doing this. He becomes one of the emperor's greatest tools in the Great Crusade, and sometimes that is presented as simply Sanguinius agreeing so 100% with the emperor and loving the emperor so thoroughly that he just kneels to the emperor and does exactly what the emperor wants, because that's exactly what he wants. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and it's more of an element of similar to the Khan when he met the emperor, in that he understood the situation. From his own background, he understood that when a more powerful force arrives, meets another society, that there's really two ways things can go. So the Khan very reluctantly accepted the emperor as his overlord, essentially, and pledged himself to serve the emperor. He knew the alternative was fighting the emperor and the Imperium, a fight that he knew he couldn't win and the people of his world would suffer for. And so he picked the best option of the two, which was to serve the Imperium, even though he didn't really believe in the ideals of the emperor. As such, he had mistrusted the emperor because of what the emperor did to achieve this potential future for humanity. And Sanguinius seems to have had some element of this in his own decision to serve the emperor, and that it wasn't all about just seeing the greatness of the emperor and going, yeah, this is the guy that's going to take us to the future. He kind of just thought, well, I know that the alternative is going to be very dark for my people, so to protect them, I'll sacrifice myself and I will give myself to this obviously superior being who's so powerful that I can't protect them otherwise. If I simply try and stand against him, we're going to lose and my people will be punished for that. So it's a small sacrifice to make in giving my service to this Imperium, this emperor. And he did genuinely believe in the potential human future that the emperor wanted, this idea of a united humanity free from all of the various ills that divided humanity had. And so he could fully throw himself into that, to being almost the symbol of that future, that potential future. But it does seem like he was kind of partly conning himself that was all the Imperium was, all the emperor was. He had to kind of push aside the truth, the dark truth about the emperor and all the things the emperor had done and would do to potentially achieve that goal that didn't really align with his own principles. Now, those events say a lot about what the emperor thought of Sanguinius, because he was willing, the emperor, was willing to go against one of his strongest ideals, which was enforcing the imperial truth on everybody, to get Sanguinius to pledge his loyalty to him, to come into the imperial fold, to be this great weapon for the Great Crusade and a symbol within the Imperium. Because Sanguinius was much more than just a battlefield weapon. He wasn't just this incredible combat monster or incredible general like some of the other Primarchs were. He was those things, but above that, he was this great symbol for the Imperium. And he became that. He was worshipped by the citizens of the Imperium. He was loved, unrivaled level of love, even in some ways more loved than the Emperor himself, who was quite a kind of a distant figure. And Sanguinius was certainly loved more than any of the other Primarchs by the general population of the Imperium. And so the Emperor wanted that. He knew how great Sanguinius could be for the Imperium, and he decided, okay, I can put aside enforcing the imperial truth on the citizens of Baal. That's fine. Just let them do what they want to do on their planet, and as long as I've got this guy by my side, we've got a better chance of ultimately achieving my goals. Of course, it's not the only time he's ever done that. I mean, he did it with the Mechanicum. He put aside the entire principles of the Imperial Truth to bring the Mechanicum into the Imperium, although not fully into the Imperium, but to make the alliance with the Mechanicum between Terra and Mars, which basically allowed the Great Crusade to happen like it did with all the resources of Mars. And to do that, they had to accept that there's these tech priests. They're literally called priests. They're going around spreading this message of this machine god. Literally, all of the things they do is based on a religious cult and religious superstition. And yet he allows that because he knows that he needs the Mechanicum, which isn't very fair on some of the other Primarchs that he doesn't let that go with. But maybe he just didn't value them as much as highly as he does Sanguinius. So there you go. That is the early years of Sanguinius, and what it tells us, as much as we can from very limited sources, about him and what he was like, what he would become, how important he was to the Emperor and to the Imperium as a whole. So let me know if you agree with me on my interpretation of those events and what it says about Sanguinius as a person. Do you think he genuinely saw the potential dark side of the Emperor and what could potentially happen if he didn't join? Or was he simply overwhelmed with love of the Emperor and simply jumped on board the Emperor bandwagon and became his undying servant? As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and share. And I will see you next time.